So the Overton window is this concept of the things that are allowed to be talked about in mainstream in corporate media, the mainstream sources. And kind of the idea is you set kind of this left limit and the right limit. And so the left limit might be something like Bernie Sanders talking about socialism.
Yeah.
And that's considered like the left that we. And if you're going further than that, if you're talking about communism or communal ownership of property and things like that, no, that's crazy talk. And on the right wing side, although it keeps getting pushed more and more right, it seems like you would have things like censorship being normalized, I would say, but you have more right wing concept of things like restricting immigration or all the right wing kind of things, but going real right wing into fascistic or white supremacist type of talk, that's outside.
A substitute teacher at an Arlington, Virginia middle school has been suspended for teaching an insufficiently one-sided perspective on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Apparently, one of the students recorded the lesson and showed it to their parents, who complained to the school. The virulent post-9/11-like hysteria about Russia that has been promoted by one-sided mass media reporting on the war and by the 5 years of fact-free conspiracy mongering which preceded it, has created an environment where you'll get shouted down on social media for voicing any opinion about this conflict, apart from saying Putin invaded because he is evil and hates freedom. Voices calling for diplomacy, de-escalation, and détente are being systematically drowned out. Meanwhile, you've got massively influential pundits like Sean Hannity calling for a direct NATO airstrike on a Russian military convoy in Ukraine, without the slightest risk of losing his immense platform for advocating a move that would probably lead to a very fast, very radioactive Third World War. We can see on satellite imagery where the convoy is. I don't know, maybe some smart country, maybe NATO, might take some of their fighter jets. Or maybe they can use some drone strikes and take out the whole damn convoy, Hannity said on Premier Radio Network's The Sean Hannity Show on Wednesday. And then nobody takes credit for it, so then Putin won't know who to hit back. Hannity hastily adds that he's not talking about nuclear war, but then adds a but which completely contradicts him. But at what point is this going to end, Hannity asks. Because nobody did anything after Georgia was taken in 2008. Nobody cared about Crimea being annexed in 2014. On the other side of the illusory U.S. partisan divide, you've got MSNBC pundits like Richard Engel and Clint Watts also calling for direct hot war with Russia. Perhaps the biggest risk calculation or moral dilemma of the war so far, tweeted Engel on Monday. A massive Russian convoy is about 30 miles from Kyiv. The U.S., NATO, could likely destroy it. But that would be direct involvement against Russia and risk everything. Does the West watch in silence as it rolls? Strangest thing, entire world watching a massive Russian armor formation plow toward Kyiv. We cheer on Ukraine, but we're holding ourselves back, tweeted Watts less than 2 hours later. NATO Air Force could end this in 48 hours. Understand hand-wringing about what Putin would do, but we can see what's coming. Putin knows, stop the West, throw nuclear into discussion, and we'll come to a stop. But the world should not be held hostage to a killer of societies. The West has nuclear weapons too, and Putin's track record is clear. Every war he wins is followed by another war, Watts added. You've also got increasingly bold calls for no-fly zones and close air support from the Western political media class, which would also mean hot war with Russia. Now, theoretically, the actual decision-makers of the imperial war machine know better than to initiate a hot war with Russia, because it would likely lead to an unthinkable chain of events in which everyone loses. But what these insane, strange-Lovian calls for nuclear Armageddon do, even if they never come to fruition, is push the acceptable spectrum of debate far toward the most hawkish extremes possible. When you've got the hawks screaming that Putin is Hitler and calling for airstrikes on the Russian military, while the doves are using extremely mitigated both sides language to avoid being shouted down and censored, What you wind up with is a spectrum of debate that has been pulled so far toward insanity that the moderate position becomes support for unprecedented acts of economic warfare and funding a brutal insurgency in Ukraine. As a result, advocating for Western powers to initiate de-escalation, diplomacy, and détente becomes an extremist position, comparable to or worse than advocating for hot war with a nuclear superpower. In reality, it's the obvious moderate, sane position on the table, but taking that position unequivocally would be disastrous for the career of any mainstream politician or pundit in today's environment, because the spectrum of debate has been pulled so far toward hawkish brinkmanship. Noam Chomsky outlined this problem clearly when he said, "The smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, even encourage more critical and dissident views. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, when all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate."
You know, there's a Noam Chomsky quote about this, about what happens in the middle of the window, that used to be on this Wikipedia page. And it's no longer there. I had luckily kind of copied and pasted it out at one point. And the what used to be there was in 1998, Noam Chomsky said that the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, even encourage the more critical and dissident views within the spectrum. That gives people the sense that there's free thinking going on, while all the time the presuppositions of the system are being reinforced by the limits imposed on the range of the debate. So within that range, you let people argue and, people, but outside of that range, the discussions don't happen. And apparently, this Noam Chomsky quote was outside of that range, because now it's gone from the Wikipedia page on Overton Window, where it seemed to fit quite well.
Absolutely. I mean, you're allowed to argue till the day's end about critical race theory, and you're not allowed to talk about whether we should be spending all the money that can feed our citizens on war.
This spectrum of debate has been further shoved away from moderation with the help of pseudo-left narrative managers like George Monbiot in The Intercept, who have both published obnoxious finger-wagging articles scolding leftists who've been insufficiently servile to the US-NATO line on Ukraine, as though there's somehow not enough promotion of the State Department narrative on this subject by every single one of the most powerful governments and media institutions in the entire Western world, rather than far, far too much. The worst people in the world have their foot on the accelerator, driving us toward escalations that should terrify anyone with gray matter between their ears, while those who want to tap the brakes get their foot immediately slapped away. This is not leading good places, and we know from experience how profoundly unwise the power structure overseeing all this can be.
I see jello shots, belly buttons, neon beige, soupy rooms with sound gushing from the ceiling and rectangular basement portholes drowning in noise. Happy, ecstatic, but drowning. Or just rented places with dudes in backward caps from USC, totally chill, who believe in an unbending version of manhood. Or entire buildings flying mood light pollution pride colors, telling Taylor Swift concerts of people how to feel about chips and dip. Or lo-fi ASM artists, buying coffee from aspiring lo-fi ASM artists. Or the mental image of 24 AD archaeologists discovering how to play Fortnite, League of Legends, Cooking Mama 2 like we did. Or justifying an addiction by how truly fulfilling it is. I see Udon, Erewhon at 8, cancel culture, we're different, I'm more different, priming the conclusion, pulling it up like a weed. Or an accelerating Overton Window, trapping words, sentences, universes like flies in a cosmic geometric push to make 1 times 1 historically equal to a pearl clutch inducing real or non-real number. Or whispering things in ears that people don't realize aren't their own thoughts. Or burning libraries in 2025 because it'll purify our nation like it did in those other places and times. Or drinking oil and water from the oil and water tap. Or stopping on the side of the road to talk to the chicken man. Or dissolving ourselves in the humming, staticky, and anosmic microwave background.